Hello. Right. At the moment, we don't look like many people waiting. You second year lot seem to have disappeared into ether, a lot of you. Let's have a look. If you are coming on at the moment, can you just type something in so I can see who's actually here? Because I can't tell otherwise. And just see that there are two people watching me sit. Yes, Luke, you got the first comment. Well done. We'll see how many people we actually get from second year. Come on. No Fortnite either. See you in a bit, Luke. Right, so who have we got? Go on. Speak, people. Speak in the chat box. Tell me who's here. Dun, dun. Go on, speak to me, people. Who's here? Right, so we've got an Eden. Anybody else? These, if I don't get many people, I'm going to have to rethink how I do this for second years. It doesn't work very well with very, very few people. Are you doing all right, Eden? How are you coping with lockdown? Yes, Luke, the second years aren't very enthusiastic about it at the moment. Your first year one was good. You still at work at the school, Eden? Okay, so are you actually teaching them properly or just doing sort of letting them watch films and things? Doing their reports? Oh, we're up to 4 in theory. Hello, Gemma. How are you doing in lockdown? Anybody else who's just joined, I need to see type so I know who's actually here, other than Luke, who's always lurking. Good, good. What have you been reading? 5. Let's say we 5 actual people. Again, if you just logged in, just tell me who's actually here, so I can tell whether it's actually kind of worthwhile. I find Pride and Prejudice rather tedious, unfortunately. I'm not a big Jane Austen fan. Are you actually enjoying it? Your marks have already been submitted from our side, Eden. They've now got to be run through the. Well, they're not formally submitted, but the thingy's been done. They've now got to be submitted properly and then run through the computer system that takes into account all the other factors to come out with your final grades. Yeah, it's slow going, Gemma. I think you should read through the whole thing, but I'm not sure it's going to be the most exciting thing you've ever read. But then again, that's my personal opinion. Okay, so you don't have to trust that. Yes. I'm sure it's not your only pass, Eden. Right, I can see I'm up to 6 viewers. I don't know who's here other than Gemma and Eden and maybe Luke still lurking in the background. Called Luke and Laura. Okay. If anybody else has joined who's actually supposed to be here, just type into the chat thing. But in about a minute, I'll actually start kind of going through the stuff and just trying to link it in. If there's not many people, I'll try and make it a bit briefer. The idea, though, is that in an ideal world, you're able to kind of respond to me as well and respond to the kind of points that I've put down in the crib sheet. Beth and Molly are joining. Good if they are. So I'll give it a minute. You didn't wake up at 2 o'clock, Luke. Never mind. So actually, unless some of the other people type in, it looks more Stafford students than Newcastle students as well. Good Stafford group. See. Okay. Either way, I'm going to end up waiting ages if I don't start now. So I can see some of you here. Don't know about all of you or who the other kind of lurking people are. Basically, at this stage, I think the best way that you can revise is simply to be kind of reading around the text, reading stuff like the bits that I've sent out to you, because it's going to give you more of the kind of critical responses. It's going to make you think about the texts. It's showing you the style that you want to push towards in your own kind of writing. So the more of these that you can do, the better just in case you decide down the line to sit the exam. The other thing to think in terms of these, if you can get onto that database that I sent out, which you should be able to log into, and look at the journal articles, they are really in many ways designed more for kind of undergraduates. So as I said in that email when I first sent it out as a link, if you don't think you're going to really be doing the exam at the end of this, then you could be looking for stuff already to do with your actual university course. So if you've got certain modules, you can start trying to find materials to get you ready for that, because a lot of the universities are kind of worried that there's all these second year students who are going to come into the universities with these kind of big gaps and things essentially with it. Okay, so in an ideal world, people, you can have the crib sheet I sent out at the same time open, because I'm going to kind of refer into that. That's the kind of key points I've picked out, and the things that, just to kind of streamline the discussion, I'll kind of hone in on, and to keep it a bit ordered to start with. So I'll start with my kind of first point on the kind of crib sheet. So I've chosen the kind of quotation from the first one, from the Stylus Politics one. The Great Gatsby provides us with evidence for the multiple, seemingly contradictory readings of the book. We will show that alongside the expose of American materialism, the irresponsible behaviours of the wealthy class, the corruption in business practice, there remains a conservatism, a resistance to change, and that both are evident in the book's language. And I kind of pose to you, are there things that you can kind of agree with or disagree with around that statement? Because I can see things that, do make it a little bit kind of contradictory, that kind of miss the point maybe slightly. So what do you think about that one, people? Type in, talk to me. If we want this to work, you have to respond and say things to me. I'm not just going to monologue on this. Go to sleep. I hope you're typing, people. It'd be nice if I could see if people are typing or not. Yeah, I think that's a good point, Gemma. It's kind of assuming that the whole novel is written with one point of view in mind, whereas what we see is actually an evolution of Nick's views. And by the end of it, does he want a kind of resistance to change? He kind of suggests that at certain points, but there are other problems with it, and his view does definitely change. It's not a static view that the statement almost assumes. Other points, people. What else do you think? Eden, your view, rather than just kind of praising Gemma. What did you think? What was your view on it? from the crib sheet, Luke. So I sent you out the 2 articles, and then you got the crib sheet as well. Just kind of, so you had to read the 2 articles and then kind of think about the questions to do with certain parts of it as well. So for this one, it's the first one on there. I don't say I don't want this to be a monologue. I'll talk through some of my points. Hopefully, the rest of you will kind of put in things while I kind of talk through. Remember, in this exam, you can kind of quote a critic, and then you can challenge that critical view, as long as you've kind of got evidence from the text. Now, within this, he kind of says it exposes the American materialism, the irresponsible behaviours of the wealthy class, the corruption in business practice. Okay, I'll try and do the reminders as I go through. So he kind of says it exposes all of this, but it's resistant to change. And to me, that's a little bit kind of contradictory, because it does want a change, but it wants a change backwards almost. He's kind of exposing these in the new world rather than necessarily showing them in the old world. And even where he's seeing more traditional groups, he's showing them corrupted by these new values. Yes. So you see kind of Nick's views changing, and the kind of changing use of that color imagery is important. And those 2 visits to kind of Tom's mansion show a changing view as well, remember, where when he first goes, it's very much romanticized. As he kind of goes back again later on, he's able to see all the kind of artificiality associated with it. Fitzgerald builds that up through the imagery used with it. Any other points in relation to that one, people? I'm going to have to kind of push it forward a bit. I don't want to sit and just stare at it. Okay. If no other points in relation to that one, we try kind of thinking about the next one along the line. So I think this is kind of useful kind of quotation. I've used this one, I think, in the example point that I put out for the first years as well. So you agree with the irresponsible behaviours of the upper class. Do you think that those irresponsible behaviours are kind of linked to the modern upper class in this new world, or does he see those irresponsible behaviours in his more kind of conservative older world as well? That's kind of my problem with it, that he kind of, it makes it sound like they're part of the same world, but they're not. I bet they're loving every word of it, Eden. Okay, I'm going to move forward to the next one. So the critical inclination of The Great Gatsby is not just towards reform, but towards restoration of a social order that has been confused and disturbed by reconfigurations of power and property, by the disheveling forces of the age. Do you think that by the end of this, Nick wants a kind of restoration of this older world or not? Do you think it is a novel of kind of restoration rather than kind of change? I thought you had a good classroom control leader and you can keep them quiet. Yes, exactly. Discipline them. Yeah. So we've got to place it in the context of it being in a kind of post-war kind of narrative, where in many ways it is a restoration of the optimism within America that's kind of lost over the interwar period. Yeah, Jeremy, you're kind of carrying the rest of them at the moment. I kind of question with this one whether in the novel, if you think about the end of the novel, if you just focus on the start of the novel, there is this sense that he does want a restoration of the kind of previous time. You talk about him wanting to go back to a kind of whole world at a moral attention. But if you think about the end of the novel, it's far more about kind of change and development. It's about constantly moving forward, but being swept back into the past. And there's almost a kind of fighting against that that's being depicted. So, whilst he's drawn back into the past, whether he actually wants that movement into the past becomes a kind of debatable point. Yes, it happens, but whether it's his desire and whether it's Fitzgerald's desire to kind of show that is kind of dubious to my mind. In my mind, he wants something to kind of move forward rather than kind of pull back. Yeah, exactly. Um, Chris Forward. I don't know whether you're a random person or what for this one. Never mind. Yeah, so it becomes a debatable point, I think, in relation to that. Right. Um, is it actually Eden, or is this sort of virtual dating in the new world? Okay. Right. I think you can use that one, but again, you can challenge it. You can kind of go against it at the same time. You can say that it's depends where she kind of looks at her. Um, so if she's already forcing you to do things, that's a bit dodgy. And Molly's here. Excellent. Has Molly done the reading and everything as well beforehand? That would be good as well. Right. Okay. So I'm looking at the kind of third one that I've picked out here. And the third one, Nick can imagine the American romance. He recognizes its compelling song, a naive theme of folk consciousness, a once vulnerable and resistant to change. Nick's own career is not motivated by this theme. but he can hear its allure and entertain its enchantments. Do you agree with Nick's own career as presented of devoid of this theme? So, yeah. But now she's forcing you to say encouraged instead of forced. So is it still not forced? Do we think that Nick is not kind of taken in by this whole thing? Do we think that Fitzgerald wants us to kind of suggest that he's not motivated by this kind of song of the American romance, the American dream? Or do you think, again, that that's a bit of a kind of overextension here, that you can see Nick at various points as being kind of drawn into this essentially? What do we think in relation to that one? See if somebody as well as Gemma answers on this one. You've had a first aid emergency. The quote this time, Nick can imagine the American romance. He recognizes its compelling song, a naive theme of folk consciousness, a once vulnerable and resistant to criticism. Nick's own career is not motivated by this theme. So he's kind of saying that Nick sees this kind of everybody else being sucked into it, but he's not motivated by it. But he can hear its allure and its enchantments. So I'm kind of questioning whether you agree with that one. I'd be very, very worried, Luke, if you don't know who Nick is. So he's drawn into the mystery of Gatsby's past. Does that mean he's not following the dream itself? Where, Molly? So where in the novel do you think it suggests that he is drawn into this kind of naive dream himself? And then go on, Eden, try and develop on that. Why would that show that he's kind of almost more immune to it, essentially? Why does that show he's kind of distanced? Yeah, so he does definitely get kind of drawn into the parties in the first place. I mean, you've got to think the whole novel is centered on the fact that he himself chooses to go east as well. He chooses to go east. And why does he choose to go east if he's not following that kind of dream and what it represents as well? Think about how he first depicts that move into New York. Go on, any developments on it, people? Pop them in. Yeah, so he's presented as an outsider, and it gives him some, yeah, he's kind of looking in, he doesn't seem as involved, and he's writing this retrospectively as well. So because he's of the retrospective nature of the narrative, it does mean that he's got the ability to maybe hide the way that he was drawn into this kind of American dream at the same time, to kind of distance himself from that, and present himself as the outsider post fact. Yeah, exactly. So Nick retrospectively after Gatsby's death, maybe he no longer is kind of motivated by this theme, but up to Gatsby's death, you can argue that, against this critic here, you can say that, Gatsby's death becomes a catalyst, at which point he kind of turns and kind of changes away from it. Whereas up to this point, he's actually part of this kind of American dream, and he does see with kind of through rose-tinted spectacles, and then applies hindsight onto this. No, I reckon Gemma's getting it from her brain. Okay, they're the kind of key bits that I picked out from the first one anyway. So I tried to kind of draw it down to those kind of three kind of main quotations to kind of go with, because you can't really use masses of them in the actual thing. Let's just have a quick look at the crib sheet bits from the second one as well. Dun, 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 dun. So the second article, I think, is a useful one, in the what it does for you. It allows you to discuss kind of aspects like gender and sexuality as presented within the novel. And they've already asked a question about kind of women within the novel, but they haven't asked a question about men. So they might flip the question at some point and turn it on its head. It also allows you to talk about the American dream and the way that the American dream is undermined on one level. Okay. So my first one here, and I'm focusing on slightly further into it. So as narrator, Nick is less focused on this romance plot than on Gatsby himself and what Gatsby can teach him about his own situation. Hello, Cat. Nick has come east, he tells us from the start of the novel, to learn the bond business. He later indicates he's also in New York so he can enjoy the company of men and to escape the increasing social expectations back in the Midwest, where he's being cajoled to marry. As it unfolds for Nick, Gatsby's story, his road to West Egg, and to the wealth, power, and privilege he enjoys there, is about coming to terms with the American social order, delimited by patriarchal capitalism, in which there is little possibility for authentic love or desire separate from the economic realm. A bear. That's not a bear. Anyway, right, with that one, I kind of pose a couple of different questions that can kind of link into the criticism. Do we think that Gatsby is, Nick even, is more interested in his own situation than in Gatsby's situation? What do we think to that, people? Is he more interested in his own situation than Gatsby's? Or in Gatsby's situation only is of interest as it reflects onto his own? So with that, Molly, he becomes obsessed with Gatsby's life. But is he obsessed with Gatsby's life because it's Gatsby's life, or because it can tell him things about his own life? Okay. So the cat's gone again now. Never mind. Dun, dun, dun. That was just a test to see whether he was still here, wasn't it, Eden? Yeah, so it goes on to talk about the kind of the attraction to Gatsby potentially. I've got the other cat now. Yes. Yeah, he never acknowledges what he's done wrong. I mean, if if this statement is really that he's more interested in himself, do we ever really get much of Nick thinking about his own motivations for doing anything? Does Nick really think on himself at all through the novel beyond the very start of the novel? Does he not change at all after seeing Gatsby's failures? I mean, you could argue that his going back west reflects on that. Yeah, so potentially his leaving off of Jordan is linked to the way that he's learned from what he's seen from Gatsby. Is that what you're kind of maybe suggesting there? And in which case you could kind of use it to go with it here. So in which case, maybe if he's reflected on that and treated Jordan in the same way as kind of Daisy's treated Gatsby, then he has learned from him. He has kind of his interest in him is linked to that. Yeah, and it's very clear from the start, as kind of Gemma points out, that Fitzgerald doesn't really want us to trust Nick's narration because he makes that self contradiction so obvious. So we're always meant to kind of question him and his motivations. The other part of that one, the critic there says there is little possibility for authentic love or desire separate from the economic realm. Do you think that in Gatsby there is no authentic desire or love? Do you think there are any relationships that are separate from economics and the kind of that kind of idea underlies them essentially? So think about all the different ones. You got kind of Nick and Jordan, Daisy Tom, Gatsby Tom, Tom Myrtle. Oh, interesting. Yeah, George and Myrtle. You don't think that George loved Myrtle? Go on, you're gonna have to give us reasons for that one. Why don't you think that George loved Myrtle? Yeah, I'd forgotten about George and Myrtle. They kind of you focus just on Myrtle as linked to. Yeah, go on. So why did she marry George Wilson? What does Fitzgerald suggest her motivations in marrying him were? When she's talking at the party, what does she kind of suggest? Yeah, so the attraction to George was always kind of linked to her expectations, and there is an economic aspect there. Yeah, as Gemma points out, Daisy does suggest she did love Tom, and she places it in the past tense. But even then, think about the way in which that relationship is kind of built up. And in that relationship, is it that she loved Tom or did she love the stability that went with him? Yeah. And Luke, yeah, Myrtle went car coffin. Yeah. So Myrtle definitely more kind of interested in the economic value of these men. Um, what I'd kind of suggest, and I think this is an interesting point to debate around, because you've got everything mediated through Nick's narrative voice, and Nick is able to kind of draw out, the fact that probably Gatsby's more interested in Daisy because of what she represents. Do you think, though, that Gatsby ever realizes that this is what he's attracted to? And if he never realizes consciously that he's more attracted to her because of what she represents, does that not mean that Gatsby is in love with Daisy? Because he doesn't realize it's all subconscious. Yeah, so as Molly points out, there's arguably a kind of realization maybe with Gatsby that occurs that he realizes later on that he doesn't truly love her, that there's an anticlimax that goes with this, but there may well be then arguably up to this point a genuine romanticized love that is not linked in quite the same way to kind of the economic values that go with it. Yeah, so there are these various points that kind of suggest the breakup of this ideal, the fact that she doesn't love the parties, that she still loves Tom, that it's all been around a kind of the green light, his count of enchanted objects has been reduced by one. But if she was a kind of green light and an enchanted object before, is that not a kind of genuine love that we now kind of look at cynically because we're looking at it through Nick's voice? Any other thoughts on that? If you don't realize you're in love with the money, does that not make it real love? Yeah. Have a think on that one because again, you want to think how you can kind of challenge them as well. Yeah, it's sad that he's forced to change himself. So I think if you're talking about the Gatsby one, um, Gatsby arguably, he changes himself and he becomes wealthy. So it's not that he's gaining economic wealth from Daisy, it's more that he's kind of gaining social wealth. Oh, hang on. Yeah, so it's kind of there is a kind of facade that goes with it. It's the attention, and remember, it's kind of during the war, so she's kind of denied attention in other ways. Kind of goes with it. As part of it, but I mean, even within those are still aspects that people or that lead people to love each other anyway, aren't they? It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a kind of a loving relationship. If you know, if Eden's Chris was not paying her attention, would it be the same thing? Message retracted. Right, okay. The next bit in terms of the article that kind of goes through, you've got the reference to the kind of illusions that potentially the novel is based on, and it talks about the Algiers stories, and it talks about the kind of Trimalchio story, and it talks about the way in which the novel is potentially kind of built around those kind of same ideas, and those ideas of kind of the mentoring relationship that potentially has got more to it than a kind of mentoring aspect to it as well. So if we're talking about kind of the mentoring relationships, um, who are Gatsby's mentors? Who are you going to describe as Gatsby's mentors? Yeah, so you've got Dan Cody. It's interesting. So is Nick one of Gatsby's mentors, or is Gatsby Nick's mentor? Because the second article kind of suggests that Gatsby becomes a kind of mentor for Nick, but I find that kind of quite dubious. I don't think I agree with the article in relation to that bit. Yeah, and Wolfsheim is the other one. So you've got Nick helps him. Why does Nick help him though? Does that make Nick a mentor? Is Nick helping him in order to get something from Gatsby? Does that make Gatsby the mentor more than Nick? I think is the way that the article kind of pushes it. Yeah, he's interested in him, but whether he learns from him, whether there's any kind of reciprocal relationship in the same way as with Wolfsheim and Dan Cody is a dubious point, I think. So we've got Dan Cody, we've got Mayor Wolfsheim. If you've got these mentoring relationships depicted within the narrative, what's the implication about the American dream? What's the implication about how the American dream is actually achieved? Yeah, so the fact that Gatsby is truthful to Nick, or more truthful to Nick than anyone else, potentially does make him more of a mentor because he's teaching through his experience. Okay, so sorry again. The point is, if we've got these mentoring relationships, what then is the implication about how you actually achieve wealth and the American dream? Do you achieve it through hard work, or is it through something different? Go on, corrupt how? What does having these mentors mean in terms of the American dream? What's more important than hard work? Yeah, exactly. So it's only with those two mentors, with them at his back, that he can succeed. Hard work is not enough. Yes, and that his wealth, his success comes from Wolfsheim. Yes, exactly, Eden. Nepotism. That's meant. Yeah. So those two relationships, if you're talking about the American dream, and you're talking about those kind of mentor relationships, you can link in this article, and it basically shows you how the reality is that what's more important is who you know, not what you know or how much you work in the kind of achievement of the American dream. Dun, 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 dun. Okay, so he then kind of in that article develops on kind of Nick's potential homosexuality. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, sorry, I was reading an email. Yes, so the contrast is kind of George, who works hard but has no connections, and so doesn't succeed. He potentially looks to build those connections through Tom, but Tom is simply using him. So it's kind of less convincing. Anyway, so the article then moves on. It talks about kind of Nick's potential homosexuality. So if you were to get a question on kind of masculinity or something at some point, this would be useful in terms of kind of discussing how images of masculinity change. Yeah, so Myrtle would be the same. Myrtle is kind of climbing through Tom. So again, any rises we see in the text are associated not with doing something personally, but with the people that are known. So Myrtle would be another one. And rather than it being a mentoring relationship, it would be rather a kind of sexual relationship. But it's the same kind of principle here. So, yeah, this is good, people. You're making good points. Do you think, though, that he potentially kind of overstates some of the kind of sexualized imagery with Nick, or do you think that it's kind of entirely legitimate the entire way? He talks about where he kind of you get the fragmentation within the narrative, and he's then kind of waking, or he's got this kind of moment of clarity next to the I can't remember his name in bed, and he kind of suggests the sexualized element to that, and he really sells up that point. Do you agree with that? Do you think that that is meant as a kind of sexual implication, in which sexual favors have been traded for kind of Nick's help in moving up, or do you think that that's a kind of overextension. What do we think in relation to that one, people? Yeah, so you've got imagery that maybe suggests something. My problem with the whole bit around that, and again, you can argue around this in either case, is that, and again, I should have, it's completely out of my head at the moment. Um, the photographer guy appears with his wife there as well, and yes, the kind of gender conventions are reversed in each case, um, but I still don't. I'm not fully convinced by the kind of the extent of the sexualized element that he kind of suggests there. Yeah, and Gatsby, I mean, again, there is this kind of potential, kind of through the admiration of Gatsby. The kind of homoerotic undertones in the way he views Gatsby, I find more convincing than the kind of argument around the photographer guy, um, who, as I say, is kind of feminized, but I think people maybe it's yeah. Um, Maybe I do need glasses. Um, it's also it's my reading face. Remember, it's when I start reading the comments box, I have to go into kind of reading face that looks different. Yeah, and says you, Eden, who constantly forgets glasses and then has problems in lessons reading. Yes, you have glasses, but you've got to bring them with you. We're just exposing him early to your kind of foibles. Apparently, Molly Eden's invited her date to a kind of um, online Gatsby discussion. You back again? It's just the done thing, Molly, in the world of the lockdown. Right. So we think it's maybe an overextension, but it does give you a kind of a way to discuss around. We need some puns. I'll try and come up with a pun before the end. Um, the next question I kind of posed to you, it's in the article. It kind of talks about the dog collar and the chain of pearls, and it suggests that both of them kind of serve the same purpose. Um, do you think that the dog collar that Tom buys for Myrtle's dog and the pearls are meant to kind of serve the same purpose? Yeah, he could have focused more around Daisy. So we're saying yes, it does serve the same purpose. Yeah, both symbolise the belonging. What's the suggestion then that Daisy gets a pearl necklace and Myrtle gets a dog collar? What's the kind of suggestion there about the two women? If they serve the same purpose, what can you make of the difference? Yeah. So there's a kind of seeming value difference. You've got the kind of idea that the critic brings in that they are the same things, but that there's a value difference in terms of the way that Tom views Myrtle. Um, that's a kind of a nice pun on the name there. No flux given. Are you actually? Who are you? You have to tell us who you actually are as well. Yeah. So the dog collar, it becomes more literal. Um, when right, I don't quite remember that from Gatsby. Oh, Gatsby. Okay, right, okay. And you're talking about the Family Guy Gatsby as opposed to the original novel. Okay. Um, Again, you can critique. So you can critique the kind of critics again, and you can again suggest that he goes slightly too far. So the critic kind of suggests that where he goes into all the background of why Tom might be there with Daisy, or there and meet Daisy in the first place, and it talks all about a kind of fictionalized kind of horse breeding program, and why Tom might be there buying horses, and how that could be uh, hopefully not. That could be rather awkward. So it's kind of talking about the kind of background to that. On one level, it's realistic, but do you think that again you've got a critic that's kind of maybe theorizing too far about it and taking things beyond what's actually there in the novel? About 12. Oh, hello, Victoria. Your emails aren't working at all at the moment, or you. So you're not picking up ones that I'm sending out. Why do the Newcastle students always join like towards the very end of these sessions? It is English, just with a cat involved as well. Anyway, yeah. So potentially you can kind of critique the critic for going too far in relation to this. Um, let's have slightly less of the innuendo. Right. If your emails aren't working, Victoria, I can't email you from a personal account, but you can email me from a personal email account, and then I can add. It's getting sorted soon. That's fine then. You'll have a kind of be inundated with various other emails in between. Right. What's my next kind of point? Yeah, so the critic here kind of talks about the way that um, there are aspects of Gatsby that show younger and poorer men, like women, are commodities that can and do function as objects of trade between older, more powerful men. Okay. Now, with that, do you think the relationship between Wolfsheim and Gatsby, do you think that that fits with that? Do you think that to Wolfsheim, Gatsby is just a commodity, or is it kind of more than that? Go on, think about that, people, rather than consider the logistics there of Eden's Tinder thing. Go on. What would your evidence be for this? How could you kind of evidence this idea that to Wolfsheim, Gatsby is just a kind of commodity? No, this one's means, Victoria. The other one, I don't know where it's gone at the moment. Okay, so he's depicted, and you kind of you're working within the stereotypes of the time period. So yes, you've got the kind of stereotype of the Jewish community that essentially is seen as kind of commodities traders as part of it. Yeah, and the fact that he doesn't go to the funeral. What does he say in that kind of run up, in that denial to the funeral? What does he say about it? He makes Gatsby, or he says what about Gatsby? Yeah, I need to work out to put the slow mode on it, I think, with the chat sometimes. I worked out to do it for the one tomorrow, but for some reason it wouldn't let me do it to the one today. Right, so we get this kind of implication with Wolfsheim. He talks about I made Gatsby, I made him. He also kind of questions Nick as well, doesn't he? He's interested in Nick because of what Nick could provide him with as well. There's a similar kind of implication as well. I'm doing one for the first years tomorrow, ready for their mock next week, Victoria. You mean you're welcome to join that as well if you want to. Yeah, Gemma. So he depicts it as a kind of friendship, although he does distance himself at the point of kind of death. So it might be less of the kind of commodity than is initially kind of implied. I think we just ignore people if they're being irritating at this point, people, rather than rise to it. Otherwise, we have to find a different way of doing this. Yeah, and remember, why is he first drawn to Gatsby? What's the implication? He's interested in Gatsby because he's gone where? He's a what? Okay. Any other ones on that one? I'm just trying to think about kind of time on it. I'm learning how to use this, people. You've got to bear with me. Um, anyway, other bits that we kind of consider here. Other bits where potentially the critic goes too far, potentially. Um, do you think that, or the critic even argues that there's a kind of sexualized element between Dan Cody and Gatsby? Do you think that's legitimate or not? Yeah, that's an interesting point, Gemma. So Gatsby makes a better tool because he doesn't understand the kind of the social cues. He's attractive on one level, but he's kind of more naive in many ways. I don't. I on the other stream that I've kind of done for next week, I don't get the cog on this one. I was trying to do the cog. I don't get that showing on my screen for this one for some odd reason. Um, it doesn't add. So I'm having to do kind of manual bits here and there. Yeah. So you get the reference to the kind of woman who comes in, his kind of and steals the inheritance. Does that mean there can't then though be a kind of homoerotic element that comes into the relationship? Yeah, I think some aspects of this are potentially kind of overanalyzed. He kind of, if we read back through the whole thing, he kind of distances this in relation to Wolfsheim, but tries to apply it into Gatsby and Dan Cody. Um, yeah, the implication is that he doesn't necessarily kind of fancy these men, simply that it's an act of a kind of transactional act in order for them to help him move up. So he doesn't fancy Dan Cody, but it becomes a kind of transactional exchange. Yeah, again, don't necessarily argue it too far in the way of a romantic way. Yeah, more like a sugar daddy implication where it's only transactional. Do you kind of see anything of that in the Dan Cody thing, or do you think that again the critic is making far more out of this than in reality is there? Yeah. Again, I'm in agreement with you guys. I think it's the critic taking it too far. I don't think that Fitzgerald puts anything in there that suggests that there is supposed to be any kind of eroticized element to it. Yeah, and that's a good point as well. He hasn't met Daisy at this point, so yes, he potentially wants to move up, but it's not. There's not that same pressure. Yeah. Okay. Last couple of points quickly, because I'm kind of looking to end it in sort of the next 10, 15 minutes or so at the longest. So I'm going to skip past the kind of Clip Springer and Nick point. And I'm kind of interested in the bit about the shirts here as part of it. Right. So anyway, what the critic then says about the shirts, and again, it becomes a dubious point that you can kind of um, interact with and kind of, challenge again. He says, seeing the colourful silk shirts, which, like the pink suit he wears elsewhere in the novel, mark him as socially, if not sexually queer, Daisy becomes hysterical because she recognises that he's equally a victim of patriarchal capitalism. In other words, she cries for him because she sees what he has done for him to himself in order to attain his position. So, do you think that Daisy cries at this point, looking at the kind of shirts, not for any other reason other than she kind of pities Gatsby? Are these tears of pity? Yeah, so essentially, Daisy isn't really given enough depth necessarily to realize what the critic is implying here. Um, yeah, and potentially it's a kind of tears of regret rather than anything else. It's that kind of idea of her as kind of, for what could have been, for kind of the decisions of the past and things. So she's kind of sidelined here because of that. Sorry, that didn't really make much sense. It's. I think he's giving far too much credit to Daisy there. I think that she simply doesn't have that level of understanding, and Fitzgerald doesn't give her that level of understanding to kind of, really interact in that same way. Yeah, Eden, although we do get the implication that she recognizes that she herself is kind of being oppressed by this kind of patriarchy. So whether she can kind of actually recognize that in other people, though, is a kind of debatable point. And I mean, the other question to ask here is she doesn't really understand anything about how Gatsby has achieved his wealth until Tom reveals this to us later on. So, how could she at this point really be aware of that. Is that something Fitzgerald's trying to imply at all as part of it? Yeah, so the clothing that people kind of now apply back to it doesn't necessarily have those implications that people are applying to it at this stage. Yeah. Um, so again, we can disagree with the kind of critic here. We can use this as a point, but then challenge it. We can go against it. It doesn't have to be kind of a direct link into it. Um, so, as a kind of final point here, um, yeah, that's an interesting point, Victoria. So, in fact, she's actually lost some of the interest in Gatsby. Gatsby's simply become part of the world that she almost understands more. He's It's that change, and whether she's impressed by the change or whether there's also a sadness that comes with it is kind of a debatable point. Not from SCS, I don't think. I can't remember, to be honest, at this point. Um, yes, so the kind of the soldier image is kind of lost to him. Okay. Um, just realised what I don't know. I'm just gradually blocking them as they come on, Eden. This is why it's not necessarily the the best way to do it. I'm still trying to work out what is. Um, so, last one to kind of go with as part of this. Um, yeah, it's possibly what I'm thinking as well, Luke. People love to troll on the internet. Um, the critic here says that Gatsby's death can be viewed as, and this is kind of in quotation marks, an act of disciplinary violence for the challenges to patriarchal authority that he's kind of um, imposed, essentially. Okay, so that's you, Connor, there. Okay. Um, do we think that Gatsby's death is meant to kind of be a representation of his challenge to patriarchal authority and a kind of him being disciplined for that, or again do we say that this is a critic gone too far? Let's make this a kind of last point. What do we reckon to that, people? You think they go too far, but you have to be a critic as well, remember, Eden. You've got to kind of argue some interesting points of view. Yo teach, remember me. No, might need to give me a little bit more than that. Yeah, I think The way forward with these is going to have to be that we do it as a private one rather than doing it and leaving it public open. But the trouble with that is then you have to click on the link to get onto it rather than doing it in any other way. Yeah, so sorry, let's just try with this last point one more time. Can Gatsby's death be viewed as a result of an act of disciplinary violence for his challenges to patriarchal authority as embodied by Tom? Is his death because he has defied patriarchal authority or sort of male authority, because he's gone against kind of male authority? Zoom is something potentially I might try at some point. The trouble with Zoom is that you just get so much noise. If you have too many people on it, it sends me bonkers, because it gets very difficult to kind of hear and things. Let's get rid of that one as well. Yeah, so he does die because of Tom. It's just a matter of whether, it's meant to be more than just a domestic conflict. Is he meaning to kind of depict something far more socially broad in a sense? Okay. Dun, dun, dun. Yeah, so it's simply an act of kind of carelessness. It's meant to be something more incidental. It's meant to show something kind of more, um, just random than anything directly as a punishment. Yeah, the trouble is with Discord, Connor, is that we can't use anything that's got a private messaging function to it. We can only use programs that have got everything kind of open, because if I've got any kind of private messaging function, then I get in trouble basically. So Zoom is an option potentially. I'm not as familiar with Zoom, but it's something I'll look at. I think with the next one, and Molly asked if I could send it out to phone as well. I might be able to try and send out a kind of phone link to it, but I'm not sure. I'll have a go at that. Yeah, I'll have a think. I'll kind of refine my method again for tomorrow for the first years, and then have a think about how I can do it in kind of the long run. So what I'm going to do, I'll send out by email tomorrow. I've chosen 2 articles that are around the grapes of wrath. And with the 2 articles around the grapes of wrath, I'll do the same. I'll send out a kind of crib sheet again that goes with it. I'll probably send out the crib sheet though at the start of next week. And then what I'll try and do is organise another one, something along this line again, next week, just to talk around it again, and kind of go over a bit of the kind of detail of these arguments. And I'll try and see if we can do it where you do it and you have to have the link to get on, as part of it. We'll just see how that works. If not, I'll just have to go back to just doing the recorded ones. But I prefer doing it so there's a bit of kind of you get to respond slightly more directly. Anyway, right. I'm going to shut stuff for now, people. If you've got any questions about the two articles, then you can, of course, email me. And like I say, tomorrow, just check your inboxes, and I'll send you out 2 more with the crib sheet to follow, okay? Toodaloo for now, though, people.